They waited for her to fail, certain that she didn't belong there. But when Sophia solved a problem that even Stanford PhDs struggled with, the entire auditorium fell silent. And for the first time, those who had once looked down on her were forced to rethink their assumptions. MIT campus, on a chilly autumn morning. Bright fluorescent lights illuminated the massive lecture hall for advanced engineering mechanics. More than 100 students had taken their seats, flipping through their notebooks, opening their laptops, preparing to face one of the most rigorous professors in the department, Professor James Harrison. Today was not a normal class. The front rows were not only filled with students. A group of professors from different departments were present, sitting right at the front like judges observing a trial. They weren't there to learn. They were there to evaluate. This was an open lecture where Harrison would demonstrate his unforgiving teaching methods. His severity was necessary. Weak students had no place in the world of engineering, and those who weren't up to par would be eliminated from the very first round. In the middle rows, a young woman quietly lowered her head, her fingers spinning a mechanical pencil. She didn't draw attention to herself, didn't talk to anyone. A blue hoodie, simple jeans, and a notebook filled with neat handwriting. Her name was Sophia Chen. She didn't need to stand out. After all, the equations in her mind spoke for her. But for some, just the shape of her eyes was enough to give them a reason to look down on her. In the front row, Professor Martinez, one of the most influential lecturers in the department, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. His gaze swept over the students in the class, then froze when he saw Sophia. He smirked, chuckling softly. That Asian girl in an advanced engineering class? I bet she won't last the whole session. The professors next to him nodded in agreement, as if it were an obvious truth. These fields aren't meant for women. Probably got in here through some kind of diversity quota. Soft laughter echoed. No one bothered to hide it. They weren't talking about engineering. They were talking about Sophia. But Sophia remained silent. She was all too familiar with such comments. They thought she would fail. They thought they were right. They had no idea that today would be the day they made the biggest mistake of their lives. The atmosphere in the lecture hall seemed to thicken as the sharp click of Professor James Harrison's leather shoes echoed on the cold tile floor. His entrance brought an absolute wave of silence. No one dared speak. No one dared to be distracted. His posture was straight, his titanium-rimmed glasses reflecting the cold light, his face showing nothing but absolute confidence and authority that didn't need to be expressed with words. He didn't need to ask for respect because the moment he walked in, he demanded it. Harrison scanned the room, not in a hurry. He wasn't just checking for focus, he was assessing who could keep up and who was simply wasting space in his classroom. Students' gazes immediately dropped, avoiding his sharp eyes as if they feared that even a moment's distraction would make them the target. Then his gaze stopped on Sophia. It wasn't long, but it was enough to show what he was thinking. That look wasn't just observation. It was a silent message. A question unspoken but clear enough that no one could miss it. Do you think you belong here? In an instant, Harrison narrowed his eyes, then moved them away as if Sophia's existence wasn't worth his attention. No one noticed, but Sophia did. He turned, took a piece of chalk, and wrote on the board with sharp, precise strokes. Last week we studied nonlinear dynamics. Today we move on to finite element analysis. Immediately, complex equations appeared, one after the other, neat and precise. The students scrambled to take notes, trying not to fall behind. Some were confused from the very first line, but no one dared speak up. In Harrison's class, getting lost was your fault, not his. In the front row, some guest professors nodded quietly, satisfied with Harrison's teaching style. They admired him not only for his brilliance, but for his harshness as well. They believed a great teacher wasn't one who helped students grow, but one who eliminated those who didn't deserve to be there. In the middle row, Sophia didn't rush to write notes. She observed, her eyes moving over the board calmly, coldly. While others struggled to keep up with Harrison's pace, she simply looked as if those engineering symbols were mere pieces in a puzzle she had known for a long time. But then she frowned. A small mistake. Not clear enough for everyone to see, but for Sophia, it was a serious error. She glanced around. No one seemed to notice. Everyone was just copying down like machines, not really understanding what was happening. Harrison continued writing, confident as if he had never made a mistake in his life. Sophia scanned the equation again, more certain now. Yes, there was a mistake, a small deviation in how the stress tensor was applied. It wouldn't have an immediate effect, but if continued, the final result would be completely wrong. She hesitated. She knew that if she spoke up, she would become the center of attention. Harrison wasn't the type to like being corrected, especially not in front of students and other professors. He wasn't the kind of person who took challenges lightly. Moreover, Sophia wasn't naive enough to think Harrison was the only one in the room with prejudices. A whole row of guest professors were sitting there. Many of them had looked at her with disdain the moment she entered. If she spoke up, she wouldn't just be confronting Harrison. She'd be confronting the whole system. She could ignore it, let it slide, continue with the lecture like everyone else. But that thought made her feel nauseous. Sophia hated arrogance, hated people who believed they could never be wrong, hated those who looked down on others just because they didn't look like them. A decision made in a few seconds. She took a slow breath, raised her hand, and broke the silence of the room. "Professor, there's a mistake in the stress tensor." The space seemed to freeze. Harrison stopped writing. The whole class went completely silent. A multitude of eyes turned to Sophia. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the silence of the students. It was Harrison's faint smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator who had found its prey daring to challenge it. Each second stretched on endlessly. Harrison didn't need to shout, didn't need to show anger. He simply looked at Sophia, evaluating her like an engineering problem whose solution he already knew. Then he smiled lightly. "A mistake, you say?" He turned back, scanned the board as if just for show, then turned back to Sophia. "Are you sure?" His voice was soft, but beneath it was a trap laced with danger. Some of the guest professors smirked in disdain. A few students started whispering. A professor beside Martinez leaned in and whispered into his ear, "I told you she's just dug her own grave." Martinez chuckled softly, folded his arms and waited for the perfect destruction he was about to witness. Sophia stared straight into Harrison's eyes, unwavering. "Yes, I'm sure." Harrison stopped smiling, and for a split second Sophia saw his expression change, no longer a smug person, but someone who was considering whether he might have just made a mistake. The lecture seemed to freeze in that moment. The rustling of pages, the hurried typing on keyboards, all went silent. Only one thing remained, the razor-sharp gaze of Harrison. His eyes pierced through another student who had just spoken up, neither angry nor raised in volume, but enough to make every cell in the opposing person's body shrink in fear. "Do you think, or do you know?" The question echoed in the stillness, steady like a blade gliding across the surface of glass. There was no explosion of anger, only a chilling coldness, an unspoken reminder that in this room, only one person was allowed to speak the truth. The student froze, gripping her pen as if it were her only lifeline. I just thought that, if you're not sure, don't waste my time." The invisible strike had fallen. Her face turned crimson. She lowered her head quickly, retreating as if she wished to disappear. No one spoke. No one wanted to be the next target. Sophia closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. She had witnessed too many scenes like this before. Professors who placed themselves on a pedestal, treating students as those without the right to question, like children needing to be taught through fear. She hated that kind of professor, and so she raised her hand again. The whispers dwindled, then disappeared entirely. A slight arching of Harrison's brow passed across his face. He wasn't surprised, but he didn't seem pleased either. It was a neutral expression, as if this were a game whose outcome he already knew. "Yes?" Sophia was resolute. Unlike the girl earlier, she didn't hesitate. "Actually, there's a mistake in the transformation step. The coefficient was introduced too early." At that moment, the atmosphere had completely shifted. It was no longer the hesitation of students before Harrison, but anticipation, an eager wait for someone to be crushed. And the guest professors were the most excited. Martinez chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. It was a venomous amusement. This girl thinks she's smarter than Harrison. Another professor smiled, arms crossed, eyes gleaming with anticipation, as if ready to enjoy a thrilling spectacle. Harrison didn't respond immediately. He remained standing still, staring at Sophia, his gaze unwavering. The silence stretched intentionally, as if he were allowing her to sink into her own foolishness. Then he smiled. It was not a kind smile, nor a friendly one. It was a smile full of arrogance. "Are you sure?" The question again, and this time it was not just a question. It was a warning. Sophia did not flinch. "Yes, I'm sure." A brief flicker crossed Harrison's face, but quickly he regained his usual icy expression. He slowly turned back, his eyes lifting to the board once again. The silence stretched. Sophia didn't need to look at the board because she knew she was right, but she wasn't the only one who saw the truth. Some students began whispering, a few leaning forward, trying to double-check the equation on the board. And then one of the guest professors began to pay attention. She was looking for the mistake. And Sophia knew that because the mistake was there. Harrison scanned each line of the board with extreme care, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find a reason to refute her. The truth could not be denied. But if he admitted it, he would lose the most valuable thing, his absolute authority. Sophia had put him in a position where he couldn't control the situation. Harrison clenched the piece of chalk tightly in his hand. The lecture hall seemed to freeze again. Then he turned back, looking at Sophia with a smile no longer carrying his previous arrogance. "Good. If you're so confident." He extended his hand, passing the chalk to Sophia. "Go to the board and fix it." At that moment, the whispers in the class turned into quiet laughter. Some students exchanged knowing glances, as if they understood what was about to unfold. But the most important thing wasn't how the students reacted. It was how the guest professors reacted. Martinez leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his lips curling into a faint smile. "This just got interesting." Another professor nodded, a tone of excitement in his voice. She just backed herself into a corner. They knew Harrison well. They knew this was not just a simple request. It was a trap. Sophia stood up calmly. She didn't say a word, showing no emotion on her face. But as she walked to the board, as she took the chalk from Harrison's hand, she knew she couldn't back down. Because from this moment on, this was no longer a class. This was a battle. A brief moment passed as Sophia held the chalk in her hand, but in Harrison's eyes, it was a battlefield he had already set up. He knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to threaten. A good trap isn't one that scares the prey right from the start. It's one that makes the prey step in with confidence. The moment Sophia stepped up to the board, she heard a soft chuckle from the front row. A guest professor, Professor Martinez, leaned slightly toward the colleague sitting next to him, his voice low enough for no one else to hear but clear enough to be an insulting whisper. "Look at her. She actually thinks she can do this. Let's see when she falls apart." Harrison stood there, arms crossed in front of his chest, in no rush. In his mind, the outcome of this little drama had already been decided. He had seen students like Sophia before, self-satisfied, arrogant, thinking that just because they solved a problem, they could put themselves on the same level as the great minds. But he had never lost a battle. He had never let a student, especially one like Sophia, take away his absolute power in this classroom. Sophia didn't care about the whispers behind her. She simply erased the mistake, replacing it with a more accurate transformation. No hesitation, no second thoughts. Each stroke of the chalk on the board was firm, no trembling, no errors. The classroom grew eerily silent. No more whispers like before. The students who had been mocking her were now leaning forward, staring at the board, trying to figure out what Sophia was doing. One student blinked a few times, looked at his notebook, then back at the board. Wait, did she actually fix it? Did she? No one could deny it. Harrison stared at the board, his arms crossed tighter. He couldn't refute it. The thing is, Harrison rarely made mistakes, and if he did, no one was brave enough to point them out in front of him. But now his mistake was right in front of everyone. He could ignore it. He could try to twist the situation. But once the problem was fixed correctly, he couldn't deny the truth. And Harrison hated that truth. He pursed his lips, and then nodded curtly, as if this meant nothing. Good. But Sophia didn't miss the brief tension in his expression, the slight tightening of his hand, and especially the fleeting glance between him and Martinez. An unspoken look that said the battle wasn't over yet. And then Harrison played his next card. He turned away, took the chalk, and began writing a new problem on the board. Faster, more complex engineering symbols overlapping like a maze with no exit. Some students looked at each other, confused, trying to follow the steps. But the more they looked, the more tangled it seemed. When he finished, he turned back to face Sophia, the chalk in his hand like a sword ready to strike. But if you're really that good... He placed the chalk in the tray, the clink of it cutting through the silence. Do you dare to try a harder problem? The lecture hall erupted in excited whispers. Harrison wasn't just challenging Sophia. He was challenging her in front of the entire faculty. He didn't just want to defeat her. He wanted to utterly destroy her self-esteem. A guest professor chuckled lightly, his voice filled with excitement. So the real fun is just beginning. Martinez smiled knowingly. I bet she'll stumble at the first step. Sophia looked at the problem on the board. A problem not meant for freshmen, not meant for undergraduates. A problem that even graduate students might spend hours trying to solve. Sophia took a slow breath. Not because she was scared, but because she knew exactly what was happening. Harrison wanted to push her to the edge, make her bow her head, admit she had gone too far. But what he didn't know was that she lived for moments like this. Sophia slowly placed her hand on the chalk. The room fell silent again. She was calm, showing no sign of fear. She had accepted the challenge, and if Harrison thought she would crumble, he had made the biggest mistake of his life. The chalk slid across the board like a knife cutting through the air. Harrison wrote each line deliberately, the engineering symbols curving and overlapping, as though they were not only written to challenge Sophia, but also to intimidate her. This problem was not just a challenge, it was a declaration of war. The equation stretched twice as long as the previous one, with higher-order functions, nested integrals, and a system of non-linear transformations that even the brightest students would have to chew on for hours. Harrison didn't just want to beat Sophia, he wanted to crush her in front of everyone. He wanted to turn her into an example, a reminder to every student in the class that no one could challenge him without paying the price. A visiting professor sneered, tapping his fingers rhythmically on the table with clear delight. She'll be stuck soon enough. A few students gasped, some others fell silent, unsure whether to feel fearful or excited about what was about to unfold. Harrison set the chalk down, stepped back, and turned to face Sophia. He waited. The whole class waited, but Sophia didn't flinch. She stared at the problem for a few seconds. Not too long, not too short, just enough to understand its structure. Then she began to write without a hint of hesitation, not a single second spent pondering. The chalk in Sophia's hand moved smoothly and precisely, as if her mind had already seen the answer and was simply transcribing it in the exact order she had mapped out in her head. The numbers and symbols appeared organized, the transformations performed with elegance. No unnecessary steps, no hesitations. Like a pianist gliding over the keys, each stroke of her chalk was part of a perfect engineering symphony. The murmurs in the class began to fade. At first, some students whispered, thinking Sophia was merely trying to appear confident. But then they looked back at the board and realized everything was correct. No mistakes, no stumbles. Sophia didn't hesitate, didn't revise anything. She was solving the problem at an unbelievable pace. In the front row, Martinez had stopped laughing. Harrison maintained his posture, but his fingers tightened slightly. Not out of fear, but confusion. Where had he gone wrong? He was certain this problem was tough enough to trap any student, at least for a moment. But Sophia didn't just solve it. She did so with absolute confidence. He glanced around the room, trying to find someone who felt the same as he did. Someone who was also realizing that the tide had turned. And he realized everyone else was realizing it too. Sophia wasn't just solving the problem. She was taking back control of the room. Sophia finished the last line. She set the chalk down, took a step back, and then turned to face Harrison. The silence in the classroom became suffocating. Everyone looked at the board, then at Harrison, then back at the board, as though they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. One student whispered quietly, "What the hell just happened?" A visiting professor adjusted his glasses, his gaze fixed on the board, desperately searching for any error, no matter how small. But there was nothing wrong. The problem had been solved flawlessly. Harrison stood frozen. An invisible tension hung around him, as if a rope was slowly tightening around his neck. He needed a mistake. He needed something he could use to dismiss Sophia, to regain control, to prove he was still the one in charge of the classroom. But he found nothing because there was no mistake. At the back of the room, a student let out a low whistle, a sound that broke the tense silence. Some other students began to whisper, but this time it wasn't mocking or skeptical. It was admiration, something Harrison had never expected to hear in this classroom. Admiration for a student he had purposely underestimated. Martinez, no longer looking amused, leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes narrowed. The earlier mocking confidence had completely vanished. Now, in his eyes, there was only one thing left, a discomfort mixed with a fear he didn't want to admit. It can't be. There's no way she's this good. Harrison finally spoke, but his voice was no longer as firm as before. Well, not bad. A cold, dry remark without a hint of emotion. But everyone could hear the awkwardness in it. Harrison didn't want to admit the truth, but even he couldn't deny what the whole room had witnessed. Sophia Chen had passed the test. Not just passed, she had done so perfectly, to the point where no one could argue. Sophia didn't need to smile. She didn't need to be arrogant or provocative. She simply walked back to her seat as every eye remained fixed on her, filled with astonishment. Harrison clenched his fist. He knew he couldn't let this end like this. If Sophia had passed this test, he would throw another one her way, a challenge she couldn't possibly overcome. And so he picked up the chalk again. Well then, let's see what you can do with the next problem. This battle, it had only just begun. The silence in the classroom stretched like an unresolved, tense musical note. The gazes still lingered on the blackboard, where Sophia had just solved the equation flawlessly, without a single mistake. In the front row, Martinez could no longer maintain the calm composure he had at the beginning. He raised an eyebrow, one hand on the desk, his fingers tapping lightly in rhythm with his suppressed frustration. It's impossible. Surely she must have studied this problem beforehand. His words were not only directed at the other professors, but also served as a self-reassurance. Martinez could not accept that an unknown Asian female student could solve such a complex problem more smoothly than graduate students. The professor next to him nodded in agreement but was still stunned. They didn't say it out loud, but everyone knew they had misjudged Sophia Chen. But Harrison wasn't going to let confusion take over. He wouldn't allow himself to lose. Without saying a word, Harrison walked to the lectern and pulled out a thick advanced engineering mechanics textbook, a hefty book filled with problems that even graduate students struggled to understand. He was no longer trying to corner Sophia with ordinary equations. He was going to raise the stakes to an entirely new level, a doctoral-level problem. He opened the book, flipped to a page near the end, then turned it toward Sophia. In the entire class, solve it. The atmosphere in the room immediately shifted. Whispers erupted like crashing waves. Students lifted their heads, some leaning forward, trying to see what challenge Harrison had just thrown out. One student inhaled anxiously. This is it for her. Another whispered in disbelief. Is he serious? This is a level for doctoral candidates, not freshmen. A visiting professor chuckled, but his tone was no longer mocking. Instead, it was filled with genuine curiosity. Now we'll see if this kid really has talent or if she's just lucky. Harrison didn't blink, his gaze still cold and sharp as a knife. He believed Sophia would stumble this time. He believed no student, no matter how smart, could surpass their own limits when pushed too far. He waited for her to hesitate, for her to panic, for her to falter. But what he didn't expect was that Sophia merely smirked. Not a hint of fear, not a shred of tension. She stood up, walking slowly yet confidently to the board, as if she had known this would happen. Some students held their breath, while others let out a small laugh, unsure whether it was out of nervousness or disbelief. But when Sophia picked up the chalk, everything changed. No hesitation, no awkwardness as everyone had anticipated. She immediately began solving the problem, as though she had done this hundreds of times before. Harrison narrowed his eyes. He didn't like this. He wanted to see Sophia flounder, wanted to see her stop to think, wanted to see her bite her lip or furrow her brow like the other students when faced with problems beyond their ability. But Sophia showed no sign of fear. Instead, her hand moved faster than with the previous problem, as though she had just found a problem truly worthy of her. Engineering symbols appeared on the board with a terrifying clarity. Every transformation was accurate, with no unnecessary steps. The students watching the problem began to understand that she wasn't just solving it. She was refining it, making it easier to understand, shortening the process that others might take hours to work through step by step. Some students started glancing at each other, their faces incredulous. A visiting professor tilted his head slightly, his gaze showing a trace of admiration. Impossible. Martinez instinctively clenched his fist, his face shifting from frustration to genuine concern. What the hell is this? Sophia kept writing as if unaware that the entire room was watching every stroke of her chalk. But she was fully aware. She knew exactly how Harrison and Martinez were feeling in that moment, and she relished it. 1 minute, then 2. Harrison clenched his hand, his eyes now showing a cold gleam that was no longer smugness, but real worry. Because he had made a mistake. He hadn't just challenged Sophia. He had given her the chance to showcase herself in front of the entire class. And now everyone was witnessing something undeniable. Sophia wasn't just good. She was frighteningly brilliant. Sophia set the chalk down. She took a step back, crossed her arms, her gaze calm yet sharp. The problem had been solved, and no one in the room could deny it. A visiting professor let out a soft breath, looking at the board again as if to check if he was dreaming. Harrison was silent. Martinez was silent. All the professors were silent. There were no excuses left. No one could say it was just a lucky coincidence. Sophia had won. Right on their own turf. And for the first time in Harrison's teaching career, he didn't know what to say next. The sound of chalk hitting the tray echoed clearly in the silent space. A small sound. But it marked an irreversible moment. Sophia turned around, facing Harrison. She said nothing. She didn't need to say anything. Everything she needed to convey was already on the blackboard where the doctoral-level problem had been solved perfectly, where arrogance had been defeated by truth. Harrison stood motionless, his mouth slightly opened as if he was about to say something, a denial, a rejection, some way to regain control. But nothing came out because he knew there was nothing left to say. He had waited for the moment when Sophia would falter, hesitate, make a mistake, apologize, or even give up. But instead, she solved the challenge as easily as if it were just a routine exercise. And now she stood there, waiting for him to accept what he had always refused to believe, that she was not just good, but better than he had ever imagined. A visiting professor suddenly clapped. A challenging sound, not for Sophia but for Harrison's terrifying silence. Then another professor clapped. A student stood up, then another, then a whole group. The applause started to spread across the lecture hall like a wave crashing. At first it was surprise, then recognition, and finally, absolute respect. Some students cheered. Some slapped their hands on the desk. Those who had doubted Sophia now only had admiring gazes. Harrison clenched his fists. He had lost. Not just lost a problem. He had lost on the very playing field he had once controlled completely. Lost in front of the visiting professors who had once respected him. Lost in front of the students who had once feared him. Lost to a student he had once looked down on. And what hurt him more than anything else was that he could do nothing to change that truth. Martinez, sitting in the front row, looked as if he had been doused with cold water. His face lost all smugness, his eyes only showing discomfort mixed with an unmasked fear. He wanted to refute, wanted to say something to lessen Sophia's victory, but he couldn't. There was no mistake to cling to, no way to twist the truth. Sophia had won, and everyone knew it. Amid the noise of clapping, Sophia remained calm. She didn't smile smugly as they had expected. Amid the noise of clapping, Sophia remained calm. She didn't smile smugly as they had expected. She didn't show arrogance. She just stood there silently observing, because she knew that true victory wasn't in the applause. True victory lay in the silence of those who had once thought she didn't deserve to be there. Finally, Harrison spoke. But his voice no longer had its usual sharpness, no longer the absolute confidence. He cleared his throat lightly, his gaze colder than ever, but also betraying an unprecedented confusion. Not bad. Just 3 words. No praise, no real acknowledgement, just an empty statement made only to avoid further embarrassment. Sophia nodded slightly. She didn't need him to praise her. She didn't need any of them to recognize her because she had done what no one could deny. She had let the truth speak for itself. The students were still standing, the applause not yet dying down. A few started to look at Harrison differently, not with the same absolute reverence but with curiosity. They realized something they had never considered before, that Harrison wasn't always right, that his power wasn't absolute, that a student he had once looked down on had stood up and forced him to silence in front of everyone. Harrison stared directly at Sophia, as if trying to find one last weakness to attack, but he found nothing. Because Sophia wasn't the winner just because she was smart, she won because she didn't let others define her worth. And then Harrison turned his back, heading toward the lectern. He didn't say another word. No justification, no real acknowledgement, just a long silence. An undeniable defeat. Martinez shook his head, stood up, but didn't say anything. He knew this wasn't the place for him to speak, because if he said anything now, it would only make their defeat even clearer. Sophia sat down. She didn't say anything, didn't look at anyone. She simply opened her notebook again, continuing to flip through the pages, as if what had just happened wasn't a confrontation, but just another problem she had solved. But the entire lecture hall knew that this wasn't just a problem. This was a change. A change that Harrison, Martinez, and all those who had once looked down on her would have to remember forever. Harrison sat silently at the lectern, but inside, he was a storm of fury. He could tolerate a smart student, but he couldn't tolerate a student making him look foolish right in front of the faculty board. Sophia had not only proven him wrong, but she had also made other students start to question his authority. That was unacceptable. He couldn't let her walk out of this classroom as the victor. He needed a way to regain control, a way to push her into a game she could not win. He knew one thing for sure. Being smart is one thing, but when real pressure hits, how many can stand strong? And so he played his final card. Harrison stood up slowly, walking to the center of the classroom, showing no signs of anger or disappointment. Instead, he smiled, a smile full of meaning, as if he had found an escape for himself. "Well done, Sophia," he spoke slowly, carefully, as though he was contemplating something deeper. "I must admit you're more capable than I thought." Some students gasped, as if they couldn't believe what they just heard. One whispered to a friend next to him, "Did he just compliment her?" But Sophia was not fooled. She knew this was not praise. It was another trap. And Harrison didn't make them wait long to understand his intentions. However, he continued slowly, walking back toward the lectern. Real talent doesn't just belong in a classroom. He placed his hand on a stack of textbooks, and then looked directly at Sophia, his eyes gleaming as if he had just come up with the perfect way to put her in a position she could neither refuse nor win. "I think with your level of ability, a problem on the board is no longer enough to challenge you." A silence filled the room. Whenever Harrison spoke this way, it was never just an innocent suggestion. "Then why don't you try your hand at a real arena?" Some students looked up. A few even held their breath. "There's a national engineering competition next month where the brightest minds from universities across the country will compete against each other." He paused a moment, letting his words sink in before continuing. "If you're as exceptional as you think, Why not participate? The room exploded. Whispers began to spread through the lecture hall. Students turned to each other, eyes wide in shock. One whispered in disbelief, "Wait, is he really challenging Sophia to enter the national engineering competition?" Another leaned forward, excited. If she enters and wins, that would be the biggest shock in the history of the engineering department. But some were not so optimistic. This isn't just any competition. There are senior students, grad students, even geniuses from MIT and Stanford. No one can win there without years of experience. Harrison knew exactly that. He hadn't chosen this competition randomly. He knew that the pressure of a national competition was unlike solving a problem in class. Under the time pressure, in front of hundreds of people, with competitors who had been training for years, anyone could break. And he believed that Sophia would be no different. All eyes turned to Sophia. Some waited for her to refuse, others hoped she would accept. Some simply couldn't believe what was happening. But Harrison didn't take his eyes off Sophia. He wanted to see her hesitate, wanted to see her confused, wanted to see her falter in the face of an overwhelming challenge. He knew she couldn't win, and if she lost, today's victory in class would be meaningless. He awaited her response, but instead of being confused or unsettled, Sophia simply nodded. No hesitation, no second thoughts, not even a moment's doubt. "All right, I'll participate." The atmosphere in the room exploded again. Some students stared wide-eyed. Some were agape. Others laughed in disbelief. One muttered softly, "What the hell?" She just accepted that challenge as if it was a normal test. Another said in shock, "There wasn't a single moment of hesitation. She's really serious." Harrison raised an eyebrow. He had expected her to hesitate. He had expected her to think it over. He had expected her to refuse, or at least be bewildered by the immense pressure. But she simply agreed as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Sophia slowly sat down, completely composed. She knew exactly what Harrison was doing. She knew he thought this competition would be her limit. But he was wrong. Because she didn't accept the challenge just to prove something to Harrison. She accepted because she had always known that she belonged in this larger arena. Harrison stood still, staring at her, showing no emotion. But inside, he felt a strange sensation. He had expected her to be afraid, but for the first time, he realized, could it be that I've just made the biggest mistake? The news about Sophia entering the national engineering competition spread through the school like wildfire. At first, it was just a buzz in the lecture halls, but before long, it became the hot topic discussed in every corner of the halls, every cafe, and every row of seats in the library. Everyone knew about the first-year student who dared to step into the arena of geniuses, a place where even the best students had to tread carefully. Some students were excited about the challenge Sophia had accepted, seeing her as a hero who dared to challenge the invisible barriers that had existed in the academic world for so long. But there were also those who were skeptical, thinking she was overly confident in her abilities without understanding the harshness of the competition. Debates broke out everywhere, with some betting on her and others mocking her, certain that Sophia would not be able to withstand the pressure of competitors who had spent years preparing for the contest. Somewhere in those discussions, Martinez maintained his rigid and skeptical stance. He didn't believe that a student like Sophia, without a solid academic foundation, without guidance from top professors, could step into the field of the greatest minds in the country. To him, people like Sophia were just fleeting flames that would soon burn out when faced with the harsh reality. But Sophia didn't care about the gossip. She wasn't seeking recognition from anyone, and didn't need to prove anything to those who never believed in her. She had only one goal: to prepare for the competition. And so she threw herself into training like never before. 4 weeks, 28 days, hundreds of hours of study. Sophia turned the library into her second home. Every morning, she arrived earlier than anyone else, opened her laptop, searched for the hardest problems from international engineering competitions, advanced textbooks, and exam papers that even the best struggled to solve. Equations, transformations, and high-level differential systems became the language she spoke every day. She didn't just solve problems mechanically. She tried to break down each one. analyzing every rule and finding shortcuts that others didn't see. If a problem could be solved in 3 different ways, she would find all 3 solutions. If a formula could be proven by several different paths, she would walk down each one. To her, solving engineering problems wasn't just about finding an answer. It was about understanding every corner of the problem, so that no obstacle could confuse her when facing the actual test. While she studied relentlessly, Alex, the only friend patient enough to follow her process, could only shake his head in disbelief. He couldn't understand what motivated Sophia to keep up such an intense study schedule for weeks on end, without showing any signs of exhaustion. "Are you trying to turn yourself into an engineering machine?" Alex asked. Sophia didn't look up, her pen still moving quickly across the paper, eyes glued to the numbers in front of her. "I only have 1 month. I don't have time to rest." Alex sighed, but then became more serious when he realized his friend wasn't joking. "Listen, I know you're smart, but do you know who you're up against? The people in this competition aren't just good, they're geniuses. Some of them have been trained since childhood, learning from the best professors, and using materials that ordinary people would never have access to. They don't just know engineering, they live and breathe it, and they don't make mistakes." Sophia paused for a moment, sat down her pen, and looked Alex in the eye with a sharp gaze. "Good, because I don't make mistakes either." While Sophia continued her training, Harrison wasn't idle. He didn't truly believe she could win, but he couldn't allow his name to be linked with a student who entered just to lose spectacularly. So he sent her an advanced engineering packet, problems even harder than what she would face in the competition. Not to help her, but to see how much pressure she could withstand. He hoped she would give up before the actual contest. But Sophia didn't back down. She solved each problem, breaking through every limit she thought she had. She didn't just learn how to solve problems. She learned how to solve them in the most efficient, fastest, and most accurate ways. She practiced with a stopwatch, pushing herself to the absolute limit, because she knew that in the competition, every second counted. She studied the thinking patterns of past champions, learned how they approached problems, and absorbed knowledge from the best to become even better. Throughout this time, Martinez watched from a distance but could find no sign of wavering in Sophia. He expected her to tire out, to get discouraged, to quit. But that didn't happen. Sophia only grew stronger. All efforts to stop her failed. The competition day was fast approaching. The entire department waited for the inevitable, a fall, a failure, a humiliation. But Sophia didn't wait for it. She just kept moving forward because she knew that while a month might not seem like much time, for someone ready to burn herself out completely, it was enough to change everything. And she was ready to change their world. The atmosphere in the large hall of the University of Pennsylvania grew tense as the candidates entered the exam room. This was no ordinary exam. It was the most prestigious national engineering competition, gathering the brightest minds from top universities. The best students from MIT, Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, Caltech, all were here, each exuding the cold confidence of those who had triumphed in countless competitions before. Sophia walked in, feeling the gaze of hundreds of eyes upon her. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with skepticism, and some, especially those from prestigious schools, didn't even try to hide their contempt. At the judges' table, Harrison sat alongside professors from the most renowned universities in the country. He showed no emotion, but his cold eyes swept over Sophia as if he was still waiting for the fall he was certain would come. In a corner of the room, Martinez stood with his arms crossed, staring at her intently. If Sophia failed today, he wouldn't need to say anything. The truth would speak for itself. Sophia paid no attention to these stares. She didn't need anyone's belief in her. She had practiced, prepared, and overcome every challenge they tried to place before her. Today was not the day to hesitate. A voice echoed through the microphone, pulling everyone back to reality. "Welcome, contestants, to the final round of the National Engineering Exam. Those sitting in this room are the greatest engineering minds of their generation. But today, we will find out who is the best." All eyes turned to the large screen as the first question appeared. The most complex equations began to unfold: triple integrals, Fourier series, complex function derivatives, advanced Laplace transforms, nonlinear differential equations. Each question, was not for the faint of heart. Some contestants furrowed their brows from the very first question, their pens tightening in their grip. They realized this was not a simple problem they could solve immediately. But Sophia was unfazed. She didn't look around, didn't check the reactions of others. She only looked at the problem in front of her and began doing what she did best, solving it. She lifted her pen, her writing flowing effortlessly without a moment's hesitation. The numbers appeared on the paper like an unbroken stream, transformations made precisely, without excess or omission. Some contestants paused to double-check their work, fearing they might have made a mistake. But Sophia didn't need to check. She had seen the solution the moment she finished reading the problem. Harrison glanced at the clock and saw that Sophia was moving faster than most in the room. His brow furrowed. At the judges' table, a professor from Stanford leaned over and whispered to the person next to them, "Who is that girl? How is she so fast?" "I don't know, but she's no ordinary opponent." The exam continued with increasing difficulty. Towards the end, the number of contestants still writing dwindled. Some had put their pens down, their faces showing confusion or disappointment. The final problems were designed to make even the best contestants stumble. Only two remained writing: Sophia and a PhD from MIT. He was unlike the other students. He wasn't flustered, wasn't tense. He was calm, composed, and most importantly, he wasn't making mistakes. He knew he was the strongest contender in the room. Harrison smiled faintly. This was the moment he had been waiting for. If anyone could beat Sophia, it would be him. Martinez began to look more relaxed, his cold gaze fixed on Sophia as if he already knew how this would end. She may be good, but she can't be better than an MIT PhD. The final question appeared. Everyone held their breath. This was no ordinary problem anymore. This was a challenge of thought, speed, and absolute precision. Both Sophia and her opponent glanced at the problem. The MIT PhD picked up his pen first, his eyes flashing with sharpness. Sophia only needed a second to understand everything she had to do. The real race had begun. Both wrote so quickly that even the judges had to pay attention. Lines of writing, symbols, and transformations appeared continuously on their papers, with no time to stop and think. This was no longer just engineering. This was a battle. A professor from Princeton quietly whispered, "This is the speed of geniuses." The sound of pens scratching paper echoed in the quiet space. No one spoke. No one dared make any sudden moves. Time passed. The MIT PhD was nearing the answer. Harrison looked at him, confidence filling him. This was the one who would beat Sophia. Then suddenly, someone from the judges' table gasped. Sophia had stopped writing. She was done. No strike-throughs, not a moment's hesitation. She closed her pen, set it down on the table, and sat back, arms crossed, waiting. The MIT student was still writing. Martinez straightened up. Harrison clenched his hands on the table, and the judges all turned their gaze toward Sophia. One judge stood and walked over to examine her work. Everyone held their breath. When he looked up, his eyes wide with astonishment, everyone understood. Sophia hadn't just solved the problem. She had solved it perfectly, concisely, and more elegantly than anyone else in the room. She had won. And at that moment, Harrison knew he had made the biggest mistake of his life thinking she could be defeated. The atmosphere in the auditorium seemed to freeze when the results of the previous problem were announced. Sophia not only solved it correctly, but also provided a solution more perfect than anyone else's. The judges, initially full of skepticism, could now only look at each other, exchanging disbelieving glances at what had just happened. Harrison remained seated, but his hand unconsciously tightened around the edge of the table. He couldn't hide a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Unease. Martinez couldn't hide his irritation. He leaned toward another judge, whispering something, but the response was just a shake of the head. No one could refute Sophia's result. But this was still not the end. The judge stood up, walked to the center of the stage, his authoritative voice cutting through the silence. We move to the final round. Hundreds of people in the auditorium held their breath. The final problem is unlike any other before. All eyes turned to the large screen as engineering symbols interwove like an inescapable maze. It was a complex, nonlinear differential equation containing transformations that even industry experts would need hours to analyze. This was no ordinary problem. It was a challenge almost impossible to solve within the time limit. The contestants stared at the screen, some holding their heads, others exchanging doubtful glances. Even the MIT professor, who had maintained absolute composure, took a few seconds to reorganize his thoughts before putting pen to paper. But Sophia simply tilted her head slightly, her eyes calmly scanning each line. She didn't need to read it over and over because she had seen the pattern that no one else had noticed. The clock began counting down. The contestants plunged into the problem at top speed. But the more they wrote, the more people furrowed their brows, stopped, erased, and rewrote. Some realized they were hitting a dead end and had to start over. Others kept going, but their pace noticeably slowed down. The MIT professor had not stopped yet, but his face revealed a hint of tension. He was scanning through methods he knew, but none provided a clear path. Harrison smirked, his eyes flashing with a glimmer of hope. This was the moment he had been waiting for. A problem difficult enough to put Sophia in a position where she couldn't find a solution. He knew this type of problem well. It required not only engineering skill but the ability to withstand extreme pressure. He leaned back in his chair, ready to wait for the moment when Sophia, no matter how brilliant, would have to succumb to something beyond her ability. But then something unexpected happened. Sophia set her pen down. The auditorium fell silent. She didn't write anymore. Not because she didn't know how to solve it, but because she had found the fastest way to the answer. Everyone else was still writing, their minds strained, their faces showing confusion. But Sophia simply looked at her work, checked it one last time, then leaned back, taking a slow breath. She had finished the problem before time was up. On stage, the judges began to leave their seats, walking toward her paper. They knew no one could have solved this problem so quickly. It was designed to test the limits of human ability. But when they looked at the solution, they knew it wasn't a mistake. Sophia hadn't just solved it correctly. She had found an entirely different approach from everyone else. The MIT professor was still writing, unaware that he had lost. Harrison could no longer sit still. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together, his gaze fixed on Sophia's solution. He wanted to find a flaw. He needed to find a flaw. But it didn't exist. Not only was it correct, but it was also correct in a way that no one else had seen. Sophia hadn't just solved an engineering problem. She had redefined how to solve a problem that seemed unsolvable. A judge looked up, scanning the room. His voice rang out, gentle yet thunderous, shattering the tense silence. "We have a winner." The auditorium erupted. Some students in the hall clapped. Some were stunned. Some still couldn't believe what had just happened. On stage, the MIT professor suddenly stopped, looking up, his eyes widening as he realized Sophia had completed the problem before he even reached the last step. Martinez sat motionless, his face devoid of any expression. Harrison could only stare. And in that moment, he knew he had lost. Not just in this competition, but in the entire perspective he had held on to. He had believed Sophia would never overcome this challenge, but he had been wrong from the very first moment. Sophia didn't stand up immediately. She didn't need to celebrate. She didn't need to shout in victory. She simply looked toward Harrison, maintaining the cold stare she had given him the first time he challenged her in class. Because she didn't need his acknowledgement. She had no choice but to realize for herself that she deserved more than everything he had ever thought. When Harrison left the auditorium, he knew that no matter what he said, he couldn't change this truth. Sophia Chen was not just a brilliant student. She was a genius they had never wanted to admit. The room seemed to explode as the judge stood up, adjusted his glasses, and looked down at Sophia's final answer sheet. In his hand was the correct answer that the organizers had prepared beforehand. But what stunned everyone wasn't that Sophia got it right, but the way she had taken an entirely different path, more streamlined, more efficient, with no unnecessary calculations. Whispers spread across the room, first from the students in the audience, then gradually to the professors and engineers following every detail of the competition. People exchanged glances. Nobody spoke, but their eyes clearly showed their immense surprise. One of the judges placed the solution on the table, turned around and spoke in a formal tone. "The winner of this year's National Engineering Contest is..." He paused for a second, letting the tension linger as if he wanted to make sure no one missed this moment. "Sophia Chen." The entire auditorium erupted. Applause thundered like a storm. Some students jumped up, clapping wildly. Others exchanged looks of disbelief, and some could only gape, unable to accept the truth. At the judges' table, Harrison was stunned. He didn't move. There was no expression on his face, but his usual sharp eyes now held an unusually vacant look. He had been ready to see Sophia fail. He had been ready to prove that she couldn't win this competition. But now, he was the one who had to face his own defeat. Sophia had not only won, she had won in a way that made everyone fall silent. Martinez sat motionless, his hand still clenched on the armrest. He couldn't speak a word. He had always believed that people like Sophia could never reach this level. He believed that to stand at the top of the academic world, one needed pedigree, privilege, and the invisible power that only a select few were granted from birth. But now, everything he believed in was shattered before his eyes. Sophia didn't need a prestigious name. She didn't need anyone to sponsor her. She didn't need to come from MIT or Harvard. She only needed herself, and herself was more than enough. Martinez ground his teeth, but he couldn't find any words to dismiss this result. The truth had spoken for itself. Sophia remained seated, calm as if nothing had happened. She didn't need to stand up, didn't need to show off or be arrogant. The numbers on the board, the completed equations, the chalk marks full of certainty, these were her voice. Harrison swallowed, but his voice couldn't escape his throat. He wanted to say something, a justification, an excuse, some way to regain balance. But there was nothing. He could only witness Sophia's victory. The judges stood up one by one, approaching her. A professor from Stanford gently tapped her on the shoulder, his voice filled with admiration. "You didn't just win. You've changed the way we see engineering." Another professor from Princeton shook his head, unable to hide his amazement. "I've never seen anyone handle a problem like that. You not only have ability, you have vision." Sophia simply nodded, not showing much emotion. To her, victory wasn't the most important thing. What mattered was that she had proven she was worthy. The students in the audience, some who had mocked her, others who had doubted her, could only remain silent. They had expected a fall, a failure, a moment when Sophia would have to accept that she didn't belong in this world. But instead, they were the ones who had to accept that they were wrong. Sophia Chen hadn't just won this competition. She had made a biased system bow down to reality, and no one could deny that. Harrison took a slow breath, trying to retain the last bit of his dignity. When he stood up, eyes were still on him, waiting to see how he would react. But he could do nothing but nod. No more sarcasm, no more challenge, only acknowledgement. Sophia looked directly at him, her gaze devoid of arrogance, but also without humility, simply the calm of someone who knew she didn't need anyone to validate her worth. Harrison knew that from this moment on, he could no longer see her as just an ordinary student, because Sophia Chen had changed the game. The next morning, the atmosphere in the MIT lecture hall was unlike any other day. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone knew that something had changed. The students who usually sat tensely hunched over, hurriedly taking notes in Harrison's advanced engineering mechanics class, now glanced at each other with meaningful looks. Soft whispers filled the room when the door opened and Harrison walked in. He maintained his usual demeanor, cold, calm, his face betraying no emotion. He placed his materials on the desk, adjusted his titanium-rimmed glasses, and scanned the room. But this time, his gaze lingered on Sophia just a little longer. She was still sitting there in the middle row as always. Nothing had changed. Still the simple hoodie, still the calm eyes, as if the events that had just passed meant nothing to her. But the entire class knew that she was no longer the nameless student she had once been. She was the National Engineering Competition champion, the one who had beaten the brightest minds from the most prestigious universities in the country, the one who had made Harrison fall silent in front of top professors. Harrison didn't speak immediately. He flipped through a few pages of the textbook as though trying to maintain his usual authority. But everyone in the room knew he could no longer pretend like nothing had happened. And then, not looking at anyone in particular, he spoke. "Before we begin today's lecture, I want to say one thing." The class went completely silent. He paused for a second as if carefully choosing his words before speaking, then continued gently but firmly. "Sophia Chen has proven that talent has no gender. A simple statement. No embellishments, no exaggerations. But it weighed more than any lecture he had ever given." The class was stunned. No one dared to utter a word, as though they couldn't believe those words were coming from Harrison, who had always been the epitome of harshness, who had always believed that only those who were truly exceptional deserved to exist in his world, the one everyone thought would never admit a mistake. But today, he stood in front of the class and acknowledged the undeniable truth. Sophia Chen was not just talented. She had broken through all the invisible barriers that people like Harrison, Martinez, and many others had deliberately set up to block her. She had changed the way they viewed fairness, real ability, and the limits of the prejudices they once believed in. And Harrison knew he could no longer deny it. Some students turned to look at Sophia, waiting for her response. But she only nodded lightly, without arrogance, without mockery. She didn't need him to speak words of praise, didn't need him to apologize, because at this moment the entire world had seen the truth. He could no longer turn away and pretend that she hadn't proven his lifelong belief to be wrong. And for Sophia, that was more than enough. Harrison turned away, picked up the chalk, and began writing the new lesson on the board. No more long speeches, no excuses or explanations. He simply continued his work. But everyone in the class understood that today's lesson was no longer like the ones before. Because Harrison was no longer the unbeatable professor, and Sophia was no longer the invisible student. In this classroom, everything had changed forever. Sophia didn't react much to Harrison's comment. She didn't need any flowery praise or a late apology. For a long time, she had understood that in this world, recognition wasn't something everyone was willing to give her, especially those who had once doubted her and tried to block her path. But that didn't matter. She let the numbers speak for themselves. She didn't argue, didn't need to convince anyone to believe in her worth, didn't need to prove herself through excuses or endless debates about fairness and prejudice. She simply did what she did best. Let engineering speak the truth that no one could deny. The equations, the numbers, the engineering symbols she had written on the board during the competition didn't need anyone to defend them. They didn't have gender, limits, barriers, or prejudice. They were either right or wrong. And in the world of engineering, Sophia was always right. She had won not just in the competition but in a much bigger battle. The battle against the skeptical looks, the mocking laughs, the unspoken rules that sought to determine her fate the moment she stepped into that classroom. No one could take her victory away. No one could change the fact that a student they had once looked down upon was now standing at the pinnacle of academia. Harrison continued with the lecture as if nothing had happened. But no one could deny the shift that had quietly entered this classroom. No more condescending looks towards Sophia. No more mocking smiles behind her back. Instead, there were curious gazes, subtle nods, whispered words of admiration. And in the eyes of some students, there was a new awareness, as if they had just witnessed some old rule being shattered before their eyes. She hadn't just won for herself. She had won so that those who came after wouldn't have to start from a lower position, just because they didn't belong to a system built to hold them back. She had changed the way they viewed ability, intelligence, and willpower. She had made those who once thought she would never be able to do this fall silent. And that was more valuable than any praise. Sophia opened her notebook, quietly continued to take notes as if today was just another normal day. But the whole world had changed, and she knew this was just the beginning. Sophia didn't need anyone to acknowledge her, because the truth had already spoken for itself. She had not only won a competition, but also defeated the prejudices that had lingered too long in the academic world. With intelligence, willpower, and determination, She had forced those who had once looked down on her to change their perspective. But this story isn't just about one individual. It's about a system, about the invisible barriers that many still face every day. If you were Sophia, if you found yourself judged before even entering the game, what would you do? Would you fight or accept stepping back? Remember that true excellence doesn't need anyone's permission. In a world where some expect you to fail based on who you are rather than what you can do, the most powerful response is not anger or despair. It's brilliance that cannot be denied. So when you face those who judge you before knowing you, don't waste energy fighting stereotypes with words. Instead, like Sophia, let your work speak for itself. Because when you deliver excellence that can't be ignored, you don't just win for yourself. You change the game for everyone who comes after you. What barriers have you faced in your life? How did you overcome them? Share your experiences in the comments below. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to continue following more empowering stories. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Did you know? Just one like from you can give me the motivation to create more awesome videos. And by subscribing with the notification bell on, you'll never miss out on my next amazing content. Don't forget to leave a comment below. Let me know what you think about this video or suggest a topic you'd like to see next.